Typically, when we talk about the cost of food, we mean the price of food. That tallies up standard economic inputs and outputs, as with any product on the market. And while that may work for widgets, according to our next guests, it is a perilously incomplete reckoning in the case of food and our food system. So, joining us now to explain, Ruth Richardson. She is Executive Director of the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, and Alexander Muller, a member of the German Council for Sustainable Development and the study leader for TEEB Agri-Food. That is a global initiative hosted at the United Nations Environment Program, and we're delighted to have you two into TVO tonight to help us understand this subject much better. And Alexander, I think I'm going to quote from your study to get us started here. Sheldon, bring this excerpt up if you would. Agriculture is arguably the highest policy priority on today's global political agenda in recognition of its widespread impacts on food security, employment, climate change, human health, and severe environmental degradation. Okay, that's from the TEEB Agri-Food report. You were the lead author on that report, and I want to get into this. Tell us just off the top, what was the report's mission?
If you look at the current situation, you will see that we have 835 million people being hungry, but we are producing enough food for everybody. We have 24 billion tons of fertile topsoil we are using annually, gone by the wind and the rain. And we also know that by 2030, we will have to feed 9.5 billion people. It's pretty clear that doing more of the same is not a recipe for success. And therefore, we have to change agriculture in order to feed a growing population and in order to develop our societies towards sustainability. Agriculture is in the center, but people don't recognize it. People are only looking at the market prices and the kilocalories consumed. And our report wants to provide a different perspective in order to be able to feed future generations and to keep the planet healthy.
Then let's dive in. Why, Ruth, in your judgment, is it important for us to understand what you call the true cost of food?
So I think, first of all, I'd like to just differentiate between price and cost.
Okay.
So what's the price of a fast food hamburger? I think it's about $2.50. That's the price of that hamburger. The cost of that hamburger is actually a lot more, and it includes the cost of deforestation in the Amazon. It includes greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere from the transportation of that meat from the Amazon to Canada. It includes medical costs that are skyrocketing now due to higher rates of stroke and obesity at the hospital. So food is really one of the most defining things, and it goes beyond the price you actually see in the store.
So obviously the $2.50 we pay for that hamburger, none of that comprises all of the extra costs that you just indicated.
Exactly, what we call externalities, costs that are external to the cost of that hamburger. So unless we understand the true costs, we're actually not going to be able to make informed and good decisions about where we need to go. So we need to understand those true costs so that businesses, for instance, can make better decisions about their supply chains, so that governments can make better decisions about their policies, so that consumers can make better decisions at the supermarket. And unless we really see that full picture, we're actually not going to get where we need to go, as Alexander had alluded. So when we look at issues like mass migration, climate change, skyrocketing healthcare costs, all of these are very complex. There are many interdependencies in that system, and without understanding that full system, we're not going to be able to make good decisions and understand the trade-offs and how we actually really get to a sustainable future.
Are you suggesting, Alexander, that if we were to put all of those externalities, you called them, into the cost of that hamburger, that hamburger clearly is not $2.50 anymore, it is what?
First of all, we would like to recognize that there are hidden costs. All the costs Ruth has mentioned. And we also have to recognize that our farmers are working in an economic environment which is highly distorted. A farmer which is a good steward of the soil doesn't get paid for it. A farmer who is mining and extracting all the nutrients and is depleting the land gets the same price for his product. And therefore, we first want to make people aware that producing food is a highly complex issue and that we are using natural resources and the market is not paying for it. Nobody wants to triple or quadruple the price of food, but policy decisions have to be based on the true cost of food. And at the same time, we see that diet is the health risk #1 in the world. So we are already paying a lot for cheap food. The World Health Organization has published a report that diabetes type 2 young people getting diabetes because of malnutrition, this costs annually 850 billion. So cheap food is already very, very expensive today.
Right.
And therefore, the whole system is not working and is undermining the ability to feed future generations. So time to act.
Okay, but when we go to the supermarket and we pick up that loaf of bread, there is, I'm assuming, no way really for us to understand all of the complex externalities that go into making that bread, right? We can't know that, can we?
So it is complex. However, what I would argue is that consumers have a right to know. They have a right to understand.
They have a right to know, but do they want to know?
Well, I think many do. If you look at, especially the young generations coming up, they are asking for a new relationship with the food they eat and the food that they buy. You see very active young kids wanting a deeper connection with the food system that we have. They want to know where it's from, who grew it, how it was produced.
Do you really know that? I mean, I appreciate the fact that they have a different relationship with food because I know they take pictures of everything they eat and put it up on social media. But does that mean they want to know all of the externalities that go into the creation of that food?
Well, I believe that yes, they do, and I believe that yes, they should be able to. There's a transparency question here. And I think that people need to know what those costs are, and I actually don't think it's that difficult. I think if we intend to provide transparency and information, we can do it. You look at tobacco labeling, for instance. So it's about intention, and if governments and companies want to do it, they can do it. And I think that people will really appreciate that and benefit from it.
Can I understand what that means, like right at the ground level then? If you go in to buy that proverbial loaf of bread, are you suggesting there ought to be a label on it indicating all of the costs in addition to that we don't now see?
Well, I think there are examples of the way different companies and countries have come at this around the globe. I think it's a bit context specific. I think there are different ways to do it. There's certification schemes, there are labeling schemes, there's a whole bunch of options.
And let's not forget, we are living in a digital society, so you don't have to put a label on it. Use your smartphone and you can get all the information. And therefore, why aren't we using it?
Scan.
And why aren't we using it for identifying for which government subsidies for agriculture really will be spent? There's an estimate that annually $500 billion are spent as subsidies for agriculture. Do we really know if they go into securing food security and ensuring that the planet will stay healthy, or are they subsidizing farming practices which deplete land and soils and pollute water? And therefore, we have to change the perspective. There are a lot of details to be discussed, but first of all, we have to change the mindset. Agriculture is an industry based on natural resources, and if we deplete the natural resources, they will be gone. And therefore, we have to close the cycle, and we have to look at all the positive and negative externalities.
Was there a time we ever paid the actual real price/cost of food?
I don't think so. I don't think so. But what has changed is the pressure on our planet has increased.
Right.
And this requires bold action. And I would like to repeat again, there are also positive externalities. Many farmers are stewards of biodiversity. We need genetic diversity to adapt to a changing climate. They don't get paid for it, and if farmers are destroying biodiversity, they get the same price. And therefore, in order to secure the future, we are forced to act in a different way. And from our perspective, looking at the externalities, positive and negative, could be one way to ensure that we change the perception of the food system.
Ruth, there is a report out called Against Cheap Food, done for your organization, the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And in that report, we learn the following. Sheldon, bring this up if you would. Duncan Pollard, Nestle's Assistant Vice President for Stakeholder Engagement on Sustainability, reported in the year 2015 that the world's biggest food company had done its own internal audit of the true environmental and social costs of its business. The number was high, so high that releasing it to the public would result in the company being, quote unquote, crucified. If these external costs, Ruth, are so high that companies are terrified to let the public know how high, how do we incorporate the costs of all of these externalities into the price we pay for food?
Yeah, well, let's not be deluded that it's going to be very difficult. It's a huge challenge. However, what I would say is that since Duncan said that in 2015, Nestle has now done 12 or more studies on the externalities and impacts of their business. So they are doing it. Other companies are doing it. Farmers are picking it up. Governments are picking it up. So I think that all of these organizations are recognizing that we have to do it, because as Alexander says, their businesses are so dependent on the raw materials around them, on local economies, et cetera. So they need to do it, and they're figuring out how to do it. There's a growing community of practitioners and academics and farmers and businesses that are figuring out the practice and the theory of true cost accounting. And they're starting to come up with some really interesting results that is shaping decision making.
Does it inevitably mean we should be paying more for the price of food?
What I would say, I think this is almost the number one myth we need to dispel. Because people say, okay, you're making cheap food more expensive. How are poor people going to afford it? First of all, I think that the whole poverty question is about poverty. It's not about the price of food. We need to deal with poverty at its root.
And crappy food makes poor people even worse off.
Well,
raising
precisely.
costs.
So then that's the second thing, is that really it's not about making cheap, unhealthy, highly processed food more expensive. It's about changing the price signals. So as a Canadian taxpayer, I give taxes to the government. The government makes decisions about where to direct subsidies. And we have a choice. Do we want those directed to highly processed food, or do we want those directed to a healthy system that's truly sustainable?
And again, the price of cheap food today is really very, very high if you include the health costs. Yes. And this is not only an issue in developed countries, increasingly in developing countries. If you go to Kenya, the Minister for Health tells you, I don't know how to finance my health system because the costs of obesity and diabetes too are skyrocketing.
But that's not a cost that is borne by the company that makes the bad food that gives people diabetes. That's a cost incurred by the taxpayer. So how do you get the company to care about that public sector cost?
We have to consider food as a system. So far, it's a silo. Agriculture, processing, distribution, health system. We have to look at it in a comprehensive way. And then we come to a completely different perspective. And this perspective has to change behavior of consumers, but it also will change the way big companies are assessing their assets. It's beautiful that Nestle says we cannot publish these figures, because this creates a lot of pressure on changing the way they are doing business. They have recognized that if they want to sell milk in the next 25 years, they have to change the way milk is produced. Otherwise, they don't have the raw material and they cannot make any profit.
Okay, forgive me, Ruth, for sounding thick here, but I really need to get a handle on this. Is one of the options you're suggesting going to, say, one of those processed food companies that makes food that tastes fantastic but is absolutely terrible for you and it'll give you diabetes if you eat it too much, saying, you know what, I shouldn't pick a brand name here, so I won't. Your junk food may be really super cheap when people buy it at the supermarket, but it's costing us billions in healthcare.
Yep.
And so we are going to force you to charge 3 times as much for that because we need to take into account what you cost our healthcare system. Can that be done?
I think it can be done. I think it's slightly more complex than that, because I think it's not just about
I told you I
forcing
was
companies.
a little thick on this, so you're going to help me out on this.
I think it's not just about forcing companies to do that. I mean, there is a regulatory regime that can do that. There are policies that can do that. But I think it's also, as Alexander's mentioned, in companies' best interest to grapple with this, because, as he says, we're not going to have a planet to farm if we don't take into account these external costs. So I think we're seeing that more and more, where farmers and companies are motivated themselves to change behavior, and through a framework like Teabag Food, they have the conceptual framework to understand those costs, to understand the trade-offs, and again, to make better decisions.
And let me try to address it from a different way. What is the advantage of having tons of sugary, cheap drinks which make people sick? You see more and more cities are now trying to put a tax on sugar.
Yes.
Because they know that if we continue to produce cheap sugar, people drink a lot of these cheap soft drinks and they have health problems. This is a way where society cannot deal with it. And therefore, the price signals are wrong, and putting a little tax on sugar is the first attempt to change it. And our study will underpin this, but it will go beyond, because we have to look at the system as a whole and try to identify, do we set the right incentives or do we set the wrong incentives?
I hear you. I don't want to get too far off the path here, though, but it's really problematic when government, as you want it to, sends the signals that, okay, you want to sell this cheap soda pop that gets people morbidly obese and sick and gets them diabetes and so on, we're going to put a tax on soda pop. But not on these fruit juices, which have just as much sugar and can be just as problematic.
That's the advantage of our study. We are looking at all externalities, independent if it's sugar or fruit juice or whatever. We want to look at the true cost of all food and therefore provide a basis for rational decision making.
Okay, here's another quote from that Against Cheap Food report that you guys got. Here's the quote from Raj Patel, the author. "There is no business model where the food industry produces cheap food without destroying the environment." That's pretty stark. You really believe that?
Well, I think that based on the study and some of the early findings of applying the TBAG framework to various systems, whether they be organic systems or conventional systems, that you do find that, yes. That
up to 50% of agricultural land globally is depleted. More or less depleted, but we have a problem with soil nutrients.
Okay,
and we know that within the next 20 to 30 years, productivity will decrease, and therefore business as usual is not an option.
How hopeful are you that there is actually out there a solution to any of this?
Of course we are optimistic, because eating good food is also something which is related to our culture, to human well-being, and we should not look only at the costs, but also at the benefits. If a child is raised with good food, the potential is growing. And therefore, let's also look at the benefits of good food. Let's look at the cultural issues. Families having a meal together, they are better off than families eating junk food here and there. And therefore, of course, we are looking at the costs. But don't forget, the society today is paying a very high price for the current food system, and we want to change it so that the society gains overall.
How open is Canada to any of these changes?
So I think Canada has been quite open on the environmental side. We've got the Eco-Fiscal Commission, we've got Sustainable Prosperity Initiative, we looked at carbon pricing. So in terms of looking at externalities and true costs, I would say there's a growing body of interest on the environmental side. On the food and agriculture side, it's still quite new and untried. There are programs, for instance, like the Alternative Land Use Services Program, but essentially it's still very new. What I would say is that there's huge potential, though, when we look at Canada's interest in developing a national food policy or in revising the agricultural framework, farm plan program. This study, TBAG or Food, can be incredibly powerful to help guide those policies. When we take it to the global level, we as a country need to figure out how we're going to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. We also have to figure out how we're going to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. And so, again, these are big decisions we're going to need to make as a country, and we're going to need to understand the interrelationships of the various systems we have, energy systems, agricultural systems, health systems, and use frameworks like this to really help us make the wisest decisions possible.
I'm sorry, but this sounds just way too daunting. Way too daunting.
But
you think we can figure this out?
I think we can, and I don't think that we can say it's too daunting, so let's not do it. I think we have to try. Human beings have done amazing things in the past, and we can do it again.
Let's use an example, food waste. We know that 1/3 of all food is wasted, maybe in Canada even more. We know that it amounts to 1.3 billion tons every year. And if you would take food waste as a country, it is the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions after China and the United States. This is a crazy system, using 1/3 of our land to produce food waste to be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So we have to change the system. Yes, it's daunting, but closing the eyes is not a solution.
How does all of this fit in with the fact that I think the amount of farmland that we have in this world, the amount of arable farmland, is shrinking, right? So how do we get to all this to figure itself out?
Let's start with food waste. We are using 1/3 of all land. We are destroying 1/3 of all biodiversity to produce food waste, to throw it away, and to create negative effects on climate. So there are actions we have to do. We also know that we have to increase productivity, but in a sustainable way. We need long-term productivity. Look at the situation of bees and insects. More and more reports are telling us dramatically we are losing insects. They are absolutely needed to keep our environment intact and to provide food. So the business as usual is a way into big problems. And so let's stop it and let's create another environment. And I think that looking at the cost of food is one of the options that could redirect consumer behavior and policies and could create new options for businesses.
Let me get you to follow up on this, Alexander. New Scientist magazine just had an article out, and the headline was, Stop buying organic food if you really want to save the planet. Now, that is completely contrary to everything that we have been taught up until now, which is that organic food is the way to go. Where are you on the quote-unquote true cost of organic food?
First of all, our framework has to be applied to all types of production, organic, non-organic, industrial, non-industrial, because we want to know the true cost of food. I know this article. This article is focusing at yields per hectare. And of course, the yields per hectare of non-organic is higher, but we pay a very high price for it. And therefore, we want to know what is the true cost of industrial food, of organic food. And we also believe that this will create new research and it will improve our food systems. Therefore, if you look at yields only, this is misleading.
Have you got a view on this headline?
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think the yield per hectare, we in the past have looked for silver bullets. The Green Revolution in India particularly, we've got to feed a very hungry continent, and so let's just grow more food. But the problem with that was that it ignored all the other factors that we also need to take into consideration. So it wasn't looking at equity, it wasn't looking at local economies, it wasn't looking at health impacts of that system. And so we have to take a systemic view. And with that systemic view, we need to scrutinize all systems, organic systems, local systems, big conventional systems. And through that, we will be more informed. And I think we will be led into a very different form of agriculture in the future.
Alexander, I just want to circle back for a second to the waste that you referred to a moment ago. How is it possible in this day and age that we still throw out so much food, particularly when there are so many people around the world who are so desperate to be fed?
There are two reasons for it. In the developing countries, there is no processing, there is no storage system. You have a lot of post and pre-harvest losses. So you have to invest a lot in order to bring the crops into the people's home. And here in our societies, food is incredibly cheap. Buy it, throw it away. If you go to a supermarket, you buy for $90 food, and on the way home, you're losing 1/3 for $30. It doesn't matter because 1/3 is food waste. So the whole system has a problem and is very much linked to cheap food.
Does that refer as well to the food that all of us have at restaurants and don't finish, leave on our plate, ends up getting thrown out?
Absolutely. In the global north, that is the issue. It's individuals wasting food in their refrigerators at the restaurant. It's very much an individual problem. As Alexander says, in the global south, it's very different. It's, potholes in the road and the truck gets stuck and the load of bananas has to be, thrown off into the ditch.
Right. Let's do one more excerpt here from this Unraveling the Food Health Nexus that I referred to just a few moments ago. Sheldon, I'm on the top of page 5 here. There you go. An urgent case for reforming food and farming systems can be made on the grounds of protecting human health. Many of the most severe health impacts of food systems trace back to some of the core industrial food and farming practices. For example, chemical-intensive agriculture, intensive livestock production, the mass production and mass marketing of ultra-processed foods, and the development of long and deregulated global commodity supply chains. Okay, Ruth, to you on this. The environmental activist and novelist Wendell Berry. You know this guy? I don't know this guy.
I know this guy.
Okay, you know this guy. He apparently famously declared that eating is an environmental act. How does your work, how does this work fit in with that statement?
So eating by its very nature has to be an environmental act because food is implicitly the environment. It's water, it's air, it's soil. So it is an environmental act. What I would say is to go one step further than Wendell is to say it's actually also a political act. In the food you buy and the choices you make, you are supporting a certain system. You're supporting, certain policies. You're supporting certain types of production. You're supporting certain kinds of farmers. Not everybody has that choice, so they're off the hook. But many of us do.
Okay, if you do have the choice, give us a do and a don't. Do this. Don't do this.
I'm not a big fan of do's and don'ts. What I have, as a mother, taught my children is be highly conscious, inform yourself, and decide what system you want to support. I would say, from my perspective, working with Tea Bagger Food and Alexander and understanding issues, I preference local food, I preference organic food, I preference getting to know the farmers, I preference buying small amounts, preparing them all at home. There are a lot of decisions I make based on the information I have.
Local farmer markets as opposed to
local farmer markets are great. opposed to big supermarkets. I never buy highly processed food, cook everything from scratch. I know there are decisions that we can each make as individuals. And I think those individuals are important because they are ultimately political decisions.
Anything you want to add to that list of do's and don'ts?
Enjoy your food. That's something very beautiful. Sitting with people on a table, having good food, having a good glass of wine, having a good conversation, it's a cultural issue. And we are forgetting it. Food is, everybody is eating on the street, not good food. So we are losing a lot of quality of our life if we don't enjoy food. But this has to be linked to a way that we will be able to produce food also tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And I think this is the real challenge. We are not doing it because we like to be accountants or to make food much more expensive. There is a growing consensus that the current food system is not able to feed the world in the next 25 to 30 years. And we have not talked about climate change so far. Climate change will put another layer of pressure on the food system. And if we don't prepare for it, if we don't have the seeds to adapt to climate change, if we are destroying biodiversity, we will not be able to adapt to it. And this is the challenge.
But I hear both things on climate change, Alexander. I hear some people saying there will be land that will no longer be arable for farming. I also hear there will be cold climates where, because of the temperature rise, they will be available for farming in ways that they weren't before. Do you know whether it balances out?
What we know for sure is that the current amount of emissions will lead to an increase of average temperature in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, between 3 and 5 degrees centigrade.
Right.
Nobody has an idea how to do farming when the global average temperature is increasing. Rainfall patterns will change. What we also know is that Canada might benefit from changing climate because you have longer summers, but don't be too sure. You don't know how the rainfall patterns will change. So we are dealing with a lot of uncertainties. We know things will change, some will benefit, but overall, it will be a major, major challenge. And we do not really know how to deal with it if we continue business as usual. And that's the challenge ahead of us.
Last 20 seconds, Ruth.
Yeah, just to build on that, we have typically focused on energy as our way out of climate change. But in fact, the United States came out with a 2050 strategy for deep decarbonization. And guess where it points? It points to land use, food, and agriculture as both a way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and as a way to deal with other potential greenhouse gas emissions, into the air. So both there's a problem and a solution. So, we really need to grapple with the agricultural system if we're going to meet these massive global challenges as a global community.
And I thank both of you for coming in and sharing your views on it tonight here on TVO. Ruth Richardson, Alexander Muller. Dankeschön, mein Freund.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.